When the French marched into the fortress, the garrison was gone. Only the stench of burned flesh and ash led them downward, toward a hidden chamber where they found powdery remains, iron-bone fragments, and blackened crosses. Witnesses swore that 3 nights earlier a blood-red glow had hovered above the cliffs, and that people in the valley heard weeping traveling through solid stone. On the 14th of October, 1806, the forward detachments of Napoleon's Grand Army, the most efficient war machine of its age, reached the foothills of Saxon Switzerland. Above them rose Königstein, not merely a castle but a mountain turned into a weapon, a citadel believed to be untouchable for centuries. French veterans who had survived the fire of Austerlitz and Jena braced themselves for hell. They expected months of grinding siege work, the roar of hundreds of cannons, grapeshot tearing entire ranks from the rocky slopes, and the desperate resistance of a Prussian garrison with nowhere left to retreat. Every rule of war said this fortress would cost thousands of lives and rivers of blood. But that day history decided to play a cruel trick on the conquerors, because instead of cannon thunder and whistling bullets, they were greeted by something worse: silence. As the vanguard climbed the winding road to the main gate, gripping their muskets so hard their knuckles whitened, they saw a sight that fit no strategist's mind. The massive doors, iron-banded and built to withstand a battering ram, stood wide open. They gaped like a gigantic stone mouth, inviting the army into an obvious, inexplicable trap, not like surrender, but like a deliberate invitation to execution. Yet the most terrifying thing was neither the dead calm nor the open gate. The wind shifted, and the smell hit them. It was thick, greasy, clinging, something that seemed to seep from the ancient stone itself, as if the fortress were sweating rot. Burned meat, singed hair, cooling ash on a scale the human mind refused to imagine. It was the stink of an enormous fire without smoke, without flames. Veterans who knew the sweet-sour reek of battlefields pressed vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces, their stomachs twisting with nausea. The odor was primal, a warning from deep inside the body that something had happened here beyond ordinary war. Bonaparte's soldiers, the finest fighters in Europe, crossed the threshold of Königstein trembling, understanding they were not entering a fortress at all, but a giant tomb. And the silence around them was louder than any artillery barrage. What Marshal Ney's forward troops found inside was worse than shellfire, because it was a whole symphony of interrupted life frozen in a single, horrible instant. The fortress had not been abandoned in panic. It had been left as if time itself had stopped for its defenders. In the barracks, mess pots still sat on rough wooden tables, the porridge barely cooled. Above half-drunk mugs of beer, a thin ghost of steam still curled, delicate and unreal. Muskets stood in perfect pyramids, polished bright, loaded, ready for a fight that never came. Letters from home lay where they had been opened and reread. Playing cards were spread out for solitaire, as if someone had only stepped away for a minute. Pipes still held unburned tobacco, waiting for hands that would never return, and yet everything felt arranged with a terrifying normalcy. For 100 Prussian soldiers, the elite of the garrison, men sworn to defend this mountain fortress to their last breath, had simply vanished. They had dissolved into the cold October air without firing a single shot at the enemy. The surreal picture of ordinary life with no living people inside it rattled the French grenadiers more than the thought of 1,000 hostile bayonets. The quiet was so heavy it seemed to press against the lungs. A spur-tapping stone sounded like thunder. But soon even that unnatural stillness was pushed aside by something far more sinister: the smell. At first it was only a sour trace woven into the damp autumn air and the wet stone chill of the walls. Then, as the French moved deeper into the courtyard, following a dark instinct toward a set of massive doors that led to the lower levels, the odor thickened until it became unbearable. It was a nauseating stew of char, burned wool, melted fat, and something else, something sweet and monstrous, instantly recognizable to any soldier who had marched through the Napoleonic Wars. Human flesh, burned, concentrated beyond anything even the worst field hospitals could produce. Officers exchanged grim looks and ordered scouts down to find the source. Grenadiers who had watched blood spill at Austerlitz and Jena now turned pale, pressing vinegar-soaked cloths to their mouths and noses, trying to filter that poisonous, oily air. They lit torches, their flames trembling in the stale darkness, and began the descent into the mountain's deepest belly. Narrow spiral staircases, carved into the rock in medieval times, seemed to lead straight into the underworld. The walls were slick with condensation, coated in centuries of mold. With every step downward, the air grew hotter and heavier, as if they were approaching the mouth of a volcano. The stench was their only guide through the underground maze. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that the heart of the nightmare waited at the very bottom, in ancient casemates rarely used even for storing supplies. Their boots echoed dully under the low stone arches, as if the mountain itself were trying to smother the sound of their presence in that cursed place. At last, the endless staircase ended at a massive door banded in blackened iron, sunk straight into the living rock. Heat poured off it like the wall of a furnace, though no open flame could be seen anywhere nearby. The stench here was so concentrated it made their eyes water, and the vinegar cloths no longer helped. Men doubled over as cramps knotted their stomachs. The sergeant leading the group crossed himself, a gesture rare and strangely telling for soldiers of a revolutionary army that prided itself on reason over faith. Then he gave a sharp signal to open it. It took 4 strong men to drag back the heavy, rusted bolts, as if they hadn't moved in 100 years. With a long, agonizing screech of metal, the door finally gave way. A blast of heat and rot rolled out so violently the men in front staggered, nearly fainting where they stood. Beyond the threshold lay an enormous vaulted hall carved into solid stone, a space few even inside the fortress knew existed outside the highest command. The trembling torchlight cut into absolute darkness and revealed something the mind refused to accept. It looked like nothing they had ever seen in war. There were no bodies in any recognizable sense, no pools of blood across the floor. Only something else, something so complete in its horror that even veterans hardened by Europe's campaigns felt their nerves break. A raw, animal fear seized them, deeper than any terror of dying under fire. They recoiled with muffled cries of disgust and panic, stumbling back toward the saving stairwell, shoving one another aside, unable to keep looking at what remained of Königstein's 400 defenders. What the grenadiers of the Grand Army saw when their torches lit that underground crypt surpassed the darkest fantasies of human cruelty. It resembled no battlefield from Austerlitz to Jena. Here there was no chaos of war, only something far worse, an absolute, cold order of death. The immense chamber beneath the fortress lay drowned in unnatural silence, broken only by the crackle of torches and the strained, choking breaths of men trying not to inhale. The floor was carpeted in a thick, sticky layer of gray ash, like wet, greasy mud that clung to their boots and resisted every step. But the true horror was what showed through that ashen veil. Across the hall, as if sculpted into the stone by a madman's hand, were blurred, melted impressions of hundreds of human forms. They were not scattered like the fallen after battle. They had been fused by an unimaginable heat into a single nightmare mass, where one body could not be separated from another. When the first soldiers forced themselves a few steps inside, their boots made a sickening crunch. They were not stepping on ash alone, but on what would later be described in reports as iron bones. From the gray powder jutted warped metal, twisted relics, the only proof of who these men had been while alive. Bent brass buckles, clotted lumps of uniform buttons stamped with Prussian eagles, bayonet fragments curled into corkscrews by temperature beyond reason. Everything cracked underfoot, creating a grotesque music of ruin. But the worst discovery, the one that made even atheists in the French ranks cross themselves, was the crosses. They found them one after another, blackened by impossible heat, some half-melted, yet still unmistakable symbols of faith. Officers began a grim count, and soon stopped on a number that froze the blood with its precision. Exactly 400 crosses. 400 souls, burned so completely that all that remained of them was belief and metal. Slowly, as shock gave way to cold analysis, a picture began to form, one far more horrifying than any accident. There were no signs of a struggle. The remains were gathered unnaturally in the center of the chamber. The heavy doors had been locked from the inside, forcing the French to break their way in. Every detail pointed to a single, monstrous design. This was not an accidental fire in a powder store, and it was not the aftermath of a mutiny. This room had been a gigantic altar, carefully prepared for slaughter. The walls were coated in a thick layer of greasy soot, proof that an enormous amount of fuel had burned here. Tar, oil, sulfur, supplies that must have been dragged down into the rock over many days. 400 men, an entire regiment of elite Prussian infantry, had been methodically, efficiently, and without mercy fed into the fire inside a sealed stone trap with no way out. It was either collective suicide or mass ritual murder on a scale no sane military mind could accept, and it had been carried out with drill-like precision and fanatical resolve, right under the nose of Napoleon's advancing army. The testimonies French investigators gathered in the surrounding villages, in the hours after the discovery, were even more disturbing than the sight of the charred remains in that cursed hall. The locals, farmers and craftsmen who had lived for generations in the shadow of the fortress, now spoke only in whispers. They crossed themselves constantly and kept glancing up at Königstein's gray walls as if expecting judgment to fall from the sky. Their scattered stories, pieced together, formed the outline of a 3-day nightmare that had unfolded before the French ever appeared. It was a picture that refused to fit ordinary military logic or common sense. Old men and women swore on the Holy Bible, pressing shaking hands to their chests, that for 3 long nights before the French vanguard rose on the horizon, something unnameable had hung over the fortress. It wasn't the familiar glow of a barracks fire or a signal blaze on a tower. Witnesses described a pulsing, oily, blood-red light that seemed to rise from the very crown of the mountain, staining the low autumn clouds the color of fresh Venus blood. It did not flicker like normal flame. It throbbed in a steady rhythm, like a sick, gigantic heart beating somewhere deep inside the stone. People in the valley said dogs began to howl the moment the glow appeared, and livestock threw themselves against their stalls in terror. But worse than the light, they insisted, was the sound that came with it. Königstein's walls were meters of solid sandstone, built to swallow even the thunder of artillery. And yet the villagers claimed that at night they heard something pushing through that impossible thickness, something that froze blood and raised the hair on the necks of even seasoned hunters. At first it was a low, vibrating drone, monotonous and heavy, like a grim ritual chant carried by hundreds of male voices fused into one hypnotic rhythm. The sound sank into the ground itself, making window glass tremble and dishes rattle on shelves at the foot of the cliff. Then, near dawn on the 3rd and final night, the chanting stopped abruptly and became something else entirely. The witnesses described it as a collective death scream, a hideous storm of voices twisted together, cries of inhuman pain, of agony, of fear beyond reason, pouring out as if the underworld itself had cracked open. A local priest, an old man shaking so violently he could barely stand, offered the only explanation his mind could hold. He said the garrison was not made of ordinary soldiers. It was made of mystics, fanatics loyal not only to the crown, but to something darker within it. They had performed an ancient rite the church had long condemned, an ordeal by fire, a ritual of cleansing. In their fevered faith, Bonaparte's army was not just an enemy force. It was the legions of the Antichrist, and so the men of the fortress chose to burn alive inside a sealed stone coffin rather than let the godless French defile their souls and their stronghold with their presence. Only decades later did the true horror begin to emerge from the dust of forgotten Prussian archives. In sealed chests marked with the highest classification, documents waited that no historian was ever meant to see. They were not ordinary military reports, but frightened whispers of a conspiracy so bleak it challenged sanity itself. The papers hinted at something festering beneath the hard discipline of the Prussian war machine. A shadow organization. A fanatic sect sworn not merely to the king, but to an ancient, secret branch of the house of Hohenzollern, one that practiced forbidden blood rites. The commandant of Königstein, whose name had been surgically erased from official records and whose body was never identified among the ash, had not simply faced defeat. He believed he was obeying a divine mandate. In a mind poisoned by archaic faith, surrender to the godless French rabble was not a strategic choice. It was a metaphysical impossibility. The archives suggested a logic so dreadful it felt like a nightmare wearing the face of reason. A mass offering of pure Prussian blood, a collective holocaust fueled by sulfur and tar, was meant to unleash a psychic shockwave, a spiritual barrier no mortal army could cross. He was not simply killing his garrison. He was forging a weapon out of their screaming souls. And here is the detail that truly turns the stomach, the moment where history dissolves into horror. Those 400 men did not die in battle. They did not perish in their sleep. They entered that underground chamber alive, in full formation, their boots striking the stone in perfect unison to the hypnotic, echoing cadence of regimental drums. Picture it. 400 hardened soldiers, the pride of Prussian infantry, marching into a windowless stone trap where the air was already thick with the acrid vapors of accelerants placed there by their own officers. They stood at attention as the massive iron-banded doors slammed shut and were barricaded from the outside, sealing their fate in coffin-dark silence. They did not break rank. They did not cry out. They held their discipline even as the hiss of ignited fuses cut through the stillness, followed by the sudden, blinding eruption of carefully stacked barrels of tar and sulfur. It was the ultimate, grotesque expression of Prussian obedience. 400 human beings accepting a slow, brutal death by fire rather than question an order or disrupt the formation. Their final breaths were smothered by toxic smoke while their commanders watched the cleansing flames consume them all. When the detailed reports of what had truly happened beneath Königstein reached Napoleon's headquarters, the emperor, who had redrawn the map of Europe and watched thousands die, felt something bordering on superstitious dread. This was not a victory. It was a psychological disaster his disciplined, rational mind could not neatly contain. Bonaparte, a master of morale and myth, recognized the danger immediately. If his soldiers, the sons of enlightenment and revolution, learned the scale of that raw, fanatical madness, their faith in their own righteousness and invincibility would crack harder than after any defeat on the battlefield. Facing an enemy willing to burn itself alive rather than surrender could shake even the old guard. The emperor's order was swift, merciless, and absolute. Erase the event from reality. The entrance to the cursed underworld, its soot-black throat leading into a man-made hell, was sealed at once. Under the eyes of officers, masons raised a thick wall, entombing 400 charred skeletons and their melted iron crosses inside the furnace they had built for themselves. Every written report, every interrogation, every witness statement was confiscated and destroyed. The Grand Army tried to burn the memory of fire with fire. Königstein became a giant, impregnable stone sarcophagus, holding what might be the darkest and most repulsive secret of the Napoleonic Wars, a place where pride and a warped, mystical sense of honor demanded a sacrifice that made the earth itself recoil. 400 living souls were offered up with cold precision in an act of mass suicide whose logic sits beyond human understanding. And yet no amount of granite can bury darkness forever. Even now, when mid-October returns, the anniversary of that blood-red night, locals and museum guards speak in whispers about things science refuses to acknowledge. They claim that on those damp autumn evenings, certain sections of the ancient walls become inexplicably, terrifyingly hot to the touch, as if hell's breath is still pressing from beneath. From abandoned ventilation shafts that descend into the bricked-up depths of the mountain, a heavy, sickening odor rises, old smoke, sulfur, and scorched iron that never fully fades. And when the wind over the Elbe finally falls silent, the most sensitive swear they can hear it. A distant sound, muffled by kilometers of stone, yet unmistakable. A many-voiced wail, grieving and unearthly. The terrible chorus of 400 soldiers, locked forever in their last formation beneath the feet of the living.